Hello, Barbara. Thank you for staying with us. I know you were glued to your computer that entire time. And thank you all. So Professor Mennel will give us a few remarks and then open it up for your questions and comments. And take it away, Professor Mennel.
Yeah, I didn't prepare that much for after the screening. Should I wait a second? But just in part also because you are watching Hive next week, which I just watched last week. The way in which this film appears in my book, and what I'm trying to do in my book too, is think about Europe as, a contemporary shared imagination where these films share the fact that they all deal with women's work, but then that different countries imagine women's work fundamentally differently. And part of my argument in the book is that the way that I look at this film, POPULAIRE, in relationship to other films that were made in Western Europe, in which industrial work, mechanical work is projected into the past, but claimed as a heritage of modernization, industrial labor as, a moment of building civilization and liberating women, but it can only be imagined as that way by imagining it in the past. And so, the important films are POPULAIRE and Made in Dagenham, and so. But then when you look at Eastern European films, and that's what you will see in Hive, work is never that pretty. I mean, here it's pretty, it's lush, it's colorful, it's speedy, it has happy music, it liberates the woman, it leads to love. But when you look at Eastern European films, work is always drab, work post the collapse of the Eastern Bloc cannot be the path to liberation anymore. Women know that because they've lived through that illusion. But what both sort of imaginations share is that work is still a pathway to liberation for women. In the West, it's idealized as mechanical or industrial labor, and it's projected into the past, whereas in the East, it's really much harder. So you will see this in Hive, that the significance of work for women becomes visible through the resistance of the men around them, but the work itself is not pretty. So this is sort of the larger argument, and I can also talk more about that. But I was just coming in and listening to your music again at the end, and I will say, to the students who sometimes, we get obsessed with these details, and so I really was interested in this music, and I wrote a lot of footnotes, and then I had to delete them, because they were too sidetracked. But I really think that somebody needs to work more on the typewriter as a rhythm machine, and the typewriter also almost a magical and sometimes mysterious instrument, and that's how it appears, in these music videos from the 50s and the 60s. One more thing that I would like to share for those of you who have read the book, who know this from the book, but because in my book, I was interested in the question of women and work, but I was also interested in the question of European cinema. So is there a European cinema now? What does that mean? What does that mean for national cinemas? And what is the relationship of the imaginaries within Europe? And when you look at the DVD, of course, there's extra material. And there's a really strange little extra material on the DVD where the actors talk about how the French actresses didn't actually know how to use the typewriter anymore. And in order to practice typewriting for the movie, they had to bring in women from the Czech Republic because it's the women from Eastern Europe who actually still know how to use the typewriter. And they showed them in that extra DVD material. And I found this really striking and, of course, obviously also offensive. But that really emphasized this notion of, the typewriter, this kind of work as women's work as being backwards and projected onto the East, whereas in the West, it's in the past and it can be part of the national identity now, but as something that was of the past. And that there's really this projection, onto the East as this kind of timeless, not caught up, yet still tied up with the typewriter, sort of like the pre-electronic, which, if you would talk with economists or political scientists, of course, they would tell you that that's totally not true, and that a lot of the industrial production in Europe actually moved east and not in the West. So there's these real interesting temporalities that are at work. Which complicates our understanding of European cinema, because we cannot just, say, this is it's happening in French cinema, this is what's happening in Polish cinema, but they're related and they project onto each other and, have these different sense of time, of their own time and the other time, and the way in which they imagine their own past and their own future.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me if I sit here, Barbara?
I can totally hear you, yes.
Wow, amazing. Well, let's open it up with some questions, and you'll have to use the microphone, and of course you'll have to put it right up against your mask if we can hear you. So raise your hand and one of our sprightly assistants will rush very carefully on the stairs and give you the mic.
Can you hear me, Barbara?
Yes.
Thank you for sharing this, your wonderful book and this wonderful film with us. I had to double check the date to be sure, but POPULAIRE is smack in the middle of the era of Mad Men, which was 2007 to 2015, and this is 2012. It's interesting to think about it as perhaps a European reaction to Mad Men, or in relation in some way to Mad Men. Is that something that you would be willing to explore?
I would confess that it didn't cross my mind. And I think that might just be that I was so immersed in my own topic that I didn't think about it. But what your point leads me to, I guess what one could think about more is the general mid-century obsession that we're undergoing, right? What is it about the mid-century that people can embrace now, and who embraces it? If you think of furniture, Don mentioned that I'm interested in miniatures. There's a whole industry of miniature mid-century furniture that circulates. And this kind of nostalgia that allows for a criticism that's never really radical. If you think of Mad Men, for example, and the discussion of how they dealt with race, and there's this kind of marginal. So I would just be honest and say that I hadn't thought about it, but I think it would be really interesting to think it through more also in terms of gender. Like, why is Mad Men has this emphasis on the man with these very few, female characters, and then you have POPULAIRE as this counterpoint that focuses on the women, but not really. So, yeah, I like the idea, but I hadn't thought about it.
Thank you.
Oh, hi. Okay, so I have a general question about your book. So actually, we've seen the two different movies in the past few weeks. The one movie is called The Full Note, and so the movie it describes some low-scale labors, but in France. So it is actually a heritage movie. So the vibe in the movie just totally like very is little bit happy. Is little bit just don't give us a vibe is that very lively. But on the other side, we also watch a movie. It's called The Unknown Woman, right? The Unknown Woman. Okay, so it describes a immigrant from Ukraine that she moved to the Italy to have a job there. So based on your book, you describe that in a film that usually will portrays this immigrant's life just more darkly. So I just wonder, like we've watched the two different movies with two different elements. One is very lively, one is very terrifying. But imagine if there is a movie with like same kind of job, but there are some local people, but there are also some immigrants. How do you think the film will portray them? Will they portray these two kinds of people differently, or just similar? Like how do they portray the interaction of the local laborers and also the immigrants?
I think that's a really good question, and I was trying to think of whether I could come up with a film that has sort of just a positive relationship between immigrants and local workers. And maybe one is, that I'm teaching. It's called Unveiled. It's a German film, and it wasn't in this book because it's in an earlier period. It's in the late 90s. But I think what happens a lot in the films that I've written about, and I think it does capture sort of the dominant trends, is that many of the films that deal with immigration are sort of socially serious. And when they're socially serious and concerned with social problems, they really have that happy mode of POPULAIRE that you saw today. And so if they are in that more socially critical mode, using social realism, they often portray exploitation. And, one example in the book is, It's a Free World. I picked the other woman that you mentioned, because I thought that was also really interesting to me, that I actually thought dealing with immigration in genre cinema, like the horror or the psychological thriller, is a new phenomenon. If you do European film history, you know that the beginning of films about migration or minorities, in sort of the 70s, 80s, at first in England, then in France, then in Germany, was the social documentary. And then sort of the second generation, Turkish Germans, Afro-British, North Africans in France did these often also comedies, but low budget, more real life films, but not really appropriating the genre films. So I like your question. But I would say, yeah, the majority of films portray some kind of hierarchy or exploitation. I mean, one film that doesn't have to do with work, but has a very interesting European American configuration of sort of success, if you haven't seen it yet, is the new film Flee, that integrates animation and animation and storytelling, which is about a refugee from Afghanistan, and very moving. And his friend plays a major role in the film, and is just a supporting friend. So there's actually no exploitation, and that's what makes the film so moving, actually, I think, or is one of the things that makes it so moving, that it tells a very moving story about a refugee without the familiar tropes. I don't know whether this is helpful to you, but I thought your question was helpful to me. And I would argue that once it comes to work, and if you have, I don't know how much you've read, but if you read the introduction of the book, you know that there's sort of a very particular history to the representation of work, that traditionally the representation of work was always associated with, representation of exploitation, industrial labor, strikes, sort of suffering. And that disappears in this current moment where you have a proliferation of genre cinema and female characters, but I think often migrants are still the figure of suffering and exploitation, in the illegal dark sphere. And so I think that's a really good question to see, are there any other models? I hope that answered your question.
So the Italian film, The Unknown Woman, the students have seen it on their laptops or iPods or Fitbits or whatever. It's going to be screened in here in DCP on March 16th, Wednesday, March 16th, and it's a very powerful and very disturbing neo-noir that has sort of flown under the radar. I definitely would recommend that. Another question from that quadrant over there.
Hi there. I was just wondering, so the character Bob, he's obviously an American, and they go visit New York later in the movie. Do you think the inclusion of like these American scenes in contrast to the European scenes like aids the movie in a certain way, or if it was done to get a more American audience to watch the movie, possibly for popularity reasons? Or do you think it would have been better off if it were a different country, or if it were that they did the finals in, or kept like the same language throughout the entire movie, or kept the movie in France? Yeah, that's all I got.
I think that I'm sure you're right that there's a certain appeal to American audiences. I mean, not just through Bob, but in general through the narrative. But I also think that the film has a bit of self-irony or self-reflexivity in this whole invocation of populaire and, the popular. In Europe, the popular is always American. America is always the fastest, the newest, the ahead. And so, I think it's a really kind of intentional and it's slightly with a wink. It's like we're doing a film that's popular, but we know that we're doing it and that it's popular. We're aware, and that already, self-reflexivity is already sort of meta to POPULAIRE. So I think it does both, and that's what actually makes it also in a certain way almost likable, right? So I hope I answered your question, right? That it's both. I think you're right that it increases an audience, but I think it's also self-aware of its own strategy. And so, it's having sort of a wink at the audience so you can enjoy it.
First row. Yes, you. Yeah, there we go.
Well, I was interested in something you hinted at and wondered if you would develop it a little. I think you said like the film focuses on women, but not really. And how much is the success of a woman at that time her own?
That's a good question. I mean, the way I see it is that it's really, I mean, I mean, you know, like I've made this whole argument of how the film is enjoyable and easily consumable. At the same time, it's also slightly painful because we have to watch it and we know we're being sold an idea of women's liberation that's actually not really a liberation, right? And that in the year 2012, it goes back to that moment and says us being a secretary as the great women's liberation is at the same time also, you know, almost offensive. So, and that's, you know, goes back to my first answer about this nostalgia about the mid-century, you know, what is that about? Because that was really before all kind of social, you know, all kind of important social movements of the 20th century. So at the same time, I would say that, you know, when I talk to my students about the film, a lot of my students love the film. And so, you know, so I am interested in this question of that nostalgia both, but, you know, like what's first, the nostalgia for that kind of work that then enables these kinds of narratives about women's liberation, or that nostalgia for maybe a more limited liberation that goes along with a kind of, you know, almost meaningless work, because the work is really kind of meaningless. And so I find it, I mean, it's quite contradictory, even if you think about, you know, if you think about it also as a sports fan, he really is also her coach, you know, and that's a really kind of also pretty awful premise for a love story, right? That she, who's like the trainee, falls in love with her coach. So, yeah, so I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the presentation.
Hi. Getting back to the self-reflexivity of the film, and we're kind of dancing around generally its camp sensibilities, right? And, you know, I'm curious if you have European analogs to what we might see in American cinema, and generally the interaction between these two things, which is both a queer fandom for women in the workplace in the mid-century and further. I'm thinking of like a 9 to 5 or a Mary Tyler Moore, and things that have like stayed fresh through a particularly queer following. And then also the camp revitalization of those iterations, like Down with Love, which is I think 2002, 2003, and how those two might be informing one another. And I'm curious if there is something similar in Europe that might be there with either TV or films from the 70s or 80s or whenever that might have been kind of frozen or stayed relevant through queer sensibilities that then might be informing this pretty camp but also kind of butch presentation of the genre.
Okay, this is kind of almost like as if you had read my book, but pretending not to do me a favor, because, but I would also say that I had a little bit of a hard time hearing the specificity of your question, but luck will have it that in the chapter I did have a film that I think makes exactly your argument, and that is Potiche by François Ozon from 2010. And I think that's a film that's even less known here than Populaire. I think Populaire really worked as a kind of popular film, and Potiche, I don't know, I think maybe, I don't know, maybe it was too specific French, but I think Potiche does exactly what you described, that it's a camp version, but it's a camp version of the kind of social realist film of like Godard of the 1970s, 80s. And what it does, in my opinion, really smart is that it parodies the kind of liberal understanding of that film. And it's with Catherine, it has really interesting casting. It's with Catherine Deneuve and Gérard Depardieu. And Gérard Depardieu plays an old socialist, and Catherine Deneuve plays an upper, you know, like you would say the wife of the owner of the means of production who has a heart attack and is weak, and then she takes over, and she has like this fur and these pearls, and then she goes to the meeting with the unions, and the unions look like a caricature. The union members look like a caricature out of a socialist realist film. They're all like haggard, and they have missing teeth, and they're, you know, they have a long beards, and they have like, but then the camera shot is like from socialist realist, like straight on long shot, and then you have cut to Catherine Deneuve that looks like totally campy with her fur and her pearls, like dressed up with her maid going to this union meeting. And so I think that's really the film that does what you're suggesting. And yeah, I think people, I think it's kind of, it doesn't work for, it's like too much for people. Like I think they're just really can't read it that way, or that in the US, I think that it was also too French, I think maybe a little bit, that in the US, that's not totally imaginable. That it's almost like the sort of socialist realist critique of class exploitation is still sort of a holy cow, I would say. And that you cannot totally camp it. You can camp a lot, but not as a mainstream film. I don't know whether you would agree, but if you haven't seen Potiche, I think you should see it. And then I think it would answer your question.
Potiche was on the short list for the films for the course, but it just didn't quite make it. You can find it on one of the streaming services, though. It's a very funny film, but also kind of disturbing, as you say, and if you start to think about it. And potiche is French slang, it's rather derogatory for trophy wife.
And you know what, I just remember why I loved it too. I think it is explicit about its camp value in that the son then comes out to be gay, but it's really also about reproduction, like who is the offspring of the capitalist. And so, because it's really less about women's work, but it has this really subversive way to think about reproduction in the context of production. So it's also really kind of smart rewriting of Marx, but it's all under the surface of just craziness. So yeah.
So another question. Barbara, throughout the semester, I keep remarking when we have our discussions that so many things in your book anticipate in almost an uncanny way the film that we're watching that particular week, whether it's actually you're writing about the film or another one. And because so many of the concepts that you introduce are kind of multivalent and have multiple usefulnesses, it's a wonderful kind of manual for the European films of the 21st century. So it's really very, very handy to have like a kind of a Bedecker. So My question is, this is a very good example, because one of the things that you discuss throughout the book is this notion of the spectral, specter of domesticity, or the spectral housewife who keeps coming back. And wouldn't you say that the POPULAIRE is like a supreme example of that?
I would. I mean, I also think that, in a way, the interest in women and work in film has actually increased since I've written the book. I don't know whether, people in the audience are watched Maid, or also even with Hive, which is very similar to a film I discuss in the book that's called Snow, but Snow wasn't distributed as far and widely as Hive. So I think there is, yes, this increase of discussion of women in work. It has suddenly come to the foreground, but I think you're right that very often, even if we think of Maid, for those of you who've seen it, because it's like, I think it's on Netflix, like a mainstream, and it was #1 for a while. You still need the child. You still need domesticity to make a claim about inequity or inequality. And so that's using the specter of domesticity in a slightly different way than I used it in the book. But I think that's maybe where you now see it too, that when films want to make arguments about women's labor and equality or equity or social injustice, in order to make that argument, they always still have to mobilize that notion of the domestic in order to make that argument in public. And that's, just really kind of sad. So
It certainly has become a trait of the romantic comedy. And I'm thinking of, these French series like Call My Agent, or like God Help Us, Emily in Paris, where you have that same dynamic of the career versus housewife duality. And the woman has to essentially choose.
sorry, I just feel like we're also oversaturated with what we're also watching. So I was just thinking about what I'm just watching now. And now it escaped me, is it Finding Anna, or Constructing Anna, Who is Anna? And of course it's like, she's not doing these things. So that's really bad. It's really pathological, right? So if you're really not domestic, you have to be pathological,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It becomes an easy formula for writers, especially in the TV format. So I think we have time for one more. Back row.
So, sorry. I guess this is sort of an open-ended question, but when it comes to heritage films like this and some of the others that your book speaks about and that we've watched in this class, how important do you think honesty is of sort of the stories that occurred in that time frame versus reconciling that with the story that the filmmaker wants to tell, or the story that might be, more contemporarily well received?
Don, could you repeat this maybe for me? Sorry, that was hard to hear.
Yes. And tell me if I don't get it right. How does this film and some of the other heritage films deal with, what were they dealing with?
The honesty and the storytelling?
Oh yes, the honesty of the storytelling, staying true to the actual heritage versus the fictional heritage. That's actually a good question, and it's very appropriate for this film.
Well, I would say the two films that are obviously really rooted in history is, Volker Schlönder's Strike, about the Polish strike, and then Made in Dagenham, which was also about a historic strike. But, what I talk about a lot in the book, first, before I get to those two films, is the term heritage itself, and that heritage as a term, as we now know it, at least in Europe, came out of the Thatcher regime, and that a lot of historians really see heritage as already sort of corrupted history, and that, because it celebrates sort of the legacy, the positive of the history. It turns history into something positive for the nation, and so in film studies, heritage cinema is very much associated with British cinema, and that then also came out of the 80s, but is very much associated with sort of literary adaptations and very luscious, nice mise-en-scène, often British landscapes. And so it was really an important rhetorical move for me to claim that there was heritage cinema of industry. And, that was another footnote that I had to take out, but I realized, there's a whole, heritage genre. There's like all these, there's a whole heritage industry. And, but out of heritage sites, universal global heritage sites, very, very few are industrial sites. Most of them are sort of pre-industrial. So heritage is really something that nations claim that's not associated with industry. And so for me to claim that there were these films that claim industry as a heritage of the West meant that the relationship to industry has changed, and relationship to industry has changed at the moment of its disappearance. And its disappearance is both disappearance actually in that it really actually moved to the former East, but also we're living in a post-industrial period. And so, within that discourse, then both films made minor changes from the historical fact. And I think Schlöndorff is the almost more interesting one because both films turn then that history into a kind of feminist liberation again, right? And so in the story of Maid in Dagenham, it is accurate that the women won and that they got the, quote, equal pay that came out of it. But if you read the historical accounts, to them at the time, it was actually much more about class than women. And even though it was equal pay, but it was really seen as they saw it as a labor issue, much more than just this kind of feminist issue. And so it's this kind of interesting thing where, when the film then becomes a heritage genre and it gets appropriated for the nation, there's almost also a kind of de-radicalization by making it just about women. And so and that ultimately both hurts. It also hurts women because it also hurts actually the women who used to historically be active as labor activists. And Schlöndorff is similar, I don't have to go into detail, and it's also a little bit hard for me to reconstruct because he didn't actually in the end read the book, and the real person and him didn't get along, and so that's why he has to use a fake name. But then even though, they actually had disagreements, he still turns the entire solidarity movement into feminist, almost like feminist allegory, even though the woman actually disagreed with him. So, they're complicated stories. And in Schlöndorff's case, Strike, what I argue is that because it's, in his case, it's really also a projection onto the East of this kind of masculinist, industrial laborer as a woman, whereas I think, I read her biography, but not in Polish. I read it in German, I believe. She sees herself as a Catholic and a sort of poor woman that, in a way, rebelled, but also felt that the system had enabled her to move up. Like she was really like a poor orphan on the farms of of rural Poland, who became a worker in the ship industry. So it was interesting to me, I guess, if I be a little bit more focused here. I think part of my argument was that these filmmakers articulate a feminism, but it's always sort of a feminism without teeth by changing history. So it seems like it's more for women, but I think ultimately, actually, in a certain way, it's not. So I hope that was a long but hopefully satisfying answer.
So in POPULAIRE, there's a very good example of this notion of tinkering with authenticity or honesty. First, I have a question, and you have to be perfectly honest. How many knew what that round ball thing was at the end of the film? Okay, how many did not know what that was? Okay. There is definitely an age divide. That round ball thing was a component of the IBM Selectric typewriter, which was something that revolutionized typing for about a generation. I typed my PhD dissertation on one of those things. So what the film suggests is that this is a French innovation that is sort of leaked to the Americans, who then took off with it. And America is for business and France is for love, which is wonderful and outrageous. But so I did a little Wikipediaing of the IBM Selectric to find out if there was some element of truth to this, maybe they're referring to, because there's quite a bit of historical research that went into the production of the film, as you mentioned, from the DVD extras. Well, no, that story is completely bogus. The typing ball was actually developed for a toy typewriter by the Marx Toy Company, and the design was purchased by IBM to develop into the IBM Selectric. No French ingenuity at all. So, well, I want to thank you again, Professor Mennel, for being with us and taking the time. Long time. This is probably one of the longest presentations you've ever had to make from the start to the finish. And it's just been a pleasure reading your book, and I think we sort of felt like we got to know you intellectually over the few weeks. And good luck with the miniatures project. It sounds fascinating. So, and again, congratulations on your honorable mention in the Shannon Prize. It's really an incredible distinction. I believe it's the first film book to ever be recognized in the competition. So, way to go. Thanks.
Okay, and thank you for everybody asking questions with your mask on. I know how hard that is. So thank you for staying. I hear you have a storm and, braving the storm, coming here with your mask.
We don't know, but we could be getting about 4 inches of snow outside right now.
Wow.
So
I am impressed that you stayed inside. So thank you very much.
we'd rather be in Gainesville.
Yeah, I think so.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.